Well, we have a returning guest with us today, and that is none other than Dr. Melinda Anderson, the Executive Director of NACADA, the Global Community for Academic Advising. Last time we chatted with Dr. Anderson, it was episode 34, titled Recognizing Achievement and Impact. On that episode, it was a sort of a two-parter. We originally interviewed Melinda after we all found out she was voted in as the new NACADA president. And then maybe a week before the episode was to go live, we found out Melinda was actually going to be the new executive director of NACADA. So fun interviews, plural, to make that episode happen. But we're excited to have Melinda back now that she's been the executive director and chat with her some more. So Melinda, welcome back to Adventures in Advising.
Oh, thank you so much, Matt. It's exciting to be back and so good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you. And it's by the time this episode airs, it's going to be a little over 3 weeks since the end of the virtual and in-person annual NACADA conference that was hosted in Cincinnati. So my first question for you is, how's it been being back in Manhattan and coming off the conference? How was the conference for you?
The conference was thrilling. It was exciting. I know that everybody was so excited to be back and to see each other. It had been about 2 years. Last year we did have a virtual conference experience, so it was just really good to just engage with your colleagues. But we were virtual. And I think being in the same space and being able to see your colleagues and to meet new colleagues, it was just, you could just feel the excitement. I know that people were just really thrilled to be in familiar spaces. I hope that makes sense, right? So we did have people who had never been to an NACADA conference before, and they were like, this is my first conference, this is really exciting. And then, you had people who hadn't, been there before, and they were just like, oh my gosh, this feels so normal to me to be back. The pandemic has just really transformed the way that we think about our work. And so wanting to provide an experience where people felt like this is familiar, this is comfortable, but, we had a hybrid format. And so that being a new experience for us to have an in-person and a hybrid format was new for us in terms of organizing that. But I think we did a fantastic job in being able to provide 2 platforms for people to take advantage of. And that content is still available for 45 days for everybody to be able to have access to. And so, trying to get that off, I think people did a brilliant job, and we've learned a lot of lessons along the way that we'll be able to use to improve in Portland.
Yeah, absolutely. I was telling Ryan Shekel on our last episode that it didn't feel as weird being back. It's like, how's it going to be? We're back 2 years later. We have some of the restrictions with COVID, but it felt like we're, just continued on where we last left off. And it was nice seeing everyone in person instead of on a computer screen for the last 2 years. So a lot of great sessions and getting to see like people that I've considered my friends now in advising and in NACADA was so wonderful. And I guess going off of that, from what you've heard, even though it's been a few weeks, what's been the feeling, I guess, from attendees, both in person and who attended virtual, about how they felt about the actual conference?
That's actually a really great question. In terms of, I think when people were, registering and getting prepared, I think you're right. The idea of like, what is this conference experience going to be with COVID restrictions in place? We put the health and safety in terms of people having to either submit vaccination cards or take a COVID test before they entered the experience. But honestly, that was a part of the registration process, part of the check-in process. Yes, people had to wear masks. Yes, we had social distancing. But I think you're right. Because you're doing that at home or you're doing that on your own campuses, because you're experiencing that in other spaces, it really just felt like, hey, this is, a normal experience. I'm still seeing my friends. The idea, we had the bracelets where you could determine how much social distancing you want. Red, we said, 6 feet. Yellow was, elbows, and then green was high fives. And so I think that being able to tell your peers exactly what your level of comfortability was, I think really made a difference. But I think in terms of the sessions and in terms of people getting what they needed and feeling not just inspired, but informed and feeling comfortable being able to return back to their campuses, we're asking ourselves a lot of questions in terms of how do we continue to engage our students? What does support and holistic advising look like? What does our presence in terms of an advising organization mean now during the pandemic? There's no post for us. We're still supporting our students who may or may not be struggling. We're still supporting institutions that might be hurting from enrollment. So when you think about the role that advisors play at the 2-year, 4-year, private, public, there's a lot of questions that still need to be answered. And so coming and seeing your colleagues, yes, that's helpful, but people are there to get information. They're there to get research, scholarship, and to engage differently in order to take really good information back. So providing that virtually and then being in person are just those two modalities in order to get the information that you need in order to be able to make a difference on your campus.
Yeah, and that's an excellent point, especially, yes, we want to see our friends and have fun, but also we're trying to learn. And it's all about making those connections, right? And one great example, I think, is we were both sitting at a table for breakfast, and randomly someone stops and asks, "Hey, can I sit with you?" And of course, we sit there and do the whole like, "What's your name? What school are you from?" But this is a person, a provost from Wisconsin, and he starts talking about this is the first NACADA conference, I believe he said, and that he mentions he recently hired someone from California, and it turned out I already knew who that person was. But then it led into a great conversation that I really got to witness you and this provost kind of really start talking about what academic advising really is and how it can improve at their campus. We started talking about technology in advising. And it's like such a small world, but also you had this powerful conversation. And I just remember him saying, like, I just happen to now be at probably the best table because he got to interact with the executive director of NACADA and now kind of made a real connection.
Yes, no, that is actually a really great point because that's exactly how it happens, right? You never know who you're sitting next to, and you're having this powerful conversation that can really transform the way that you think about your work and the way that you think about how you're going to approach some of the either issues or concerns, or how do you take advantage of those opportunities when you get back to your campus. And passing business cards or exchanging emails or connecting on our socio app is a way that a lot of people have continued to stay connected even after leaving the conference experience. And I know that we'll stay connected. He's got a wonderful picture of what it is that he's trying to do on his campus, and he's so dedicated to student success. His campus is very lucky to have him.
Absolutely. And that's a shout out to Dr. David Travis over in Wisconsin. And who knows, maybe we might have David on as a podcast guest soon. We'll see.
Yes, I would love to do that.
And so I guess with a lot of the changes with the conference, having the virtual component, how do you think this impacts future conferences? Do you think virtual component's here to stay? I know you can't make any promises or direct answers, but I mean, what are your thoughts?
I love that question. As we were going through the conference experience, we were really trying to gauge, is this something that is a trend? Is it the way that we're solving a problem right now? Is this the way of the future? When I talk to campuses now, a lot of people are telling me about how their virtual services are providing access and opportunities when you specifically talk about particular student populations, when we talk about adult learners, or just providing a safe space for students to have access to advisors where they wouldn't normally have the opportunity to have access to them, whether that's because they're working or I wouldn't normally have time to drive, find a parking space, all those kinds of things, right, that come with complicating the idea of getting to your academic advisor. And so when we think about this hybrid dynamic, I really do see that it's the way of the future. I mean, when you think about virtual advising services, the access and equity standpoint that many of the campuses are looking at virtual services providing opportunities for, when we think about how do we support our global community when we talk about access, when we think about the format of a virtual experience and how we engage in a virtual format. We know that we have some work to do, but the access and the affordability points are things that we need to continue to explore. And we need to figure out, what does that mean for us as an association? But I definitely think that there's something that's going to stay with us as we move forward. It was undeniable about how people felt, wow, I can still attend a conference even if I can't physically get there, if I have issues and I don't want to necessarily put my health at risk. Or when I think about senior level administrators, maybe there's content that I want to have access to, but I can't afford the time right now in this moment to have immediate access to what's going on. So when I think about some of the lessons that we've learned, it wasn't the idea that this won't work. It's, how do we make this better? How do we provide different levels of content? How do we provide, maybe from in terms of how we deliver things live online? Or what does on demand look like in terms of when we make things available on the platform? So it was things like, what are we tweaking, more so than this isn't going to work, this just didn't make sense. And so I think we probably will see more of this format in the future. And when you look at our contemporary higher education associations, many of them did go to this hybrid model. And so just thinking about, how do we make this even better, is probably something that we will definitely keep in terms of how we look at our conferences in the future.
Yeah, it's, practice makes perfect. We got a taste of it with the all virtual conference for 2020, and then now with the hybrid format. So, yeah, I mean, it can only go better from here, making those tweaks and kind of reflecting back and see what went right, continue doing that, what maybe didn't go so right or what could be improved on, and then just making that better for the next conference. And I guess for anyone that might have missed your interview in episode 34, can you give us more of your background in higher ed and academic advising?
Sure, I can do that, Matt. I do recognize that, when we're in this space, it does feel very small at times, where when I do run into somebody and I'm like, I know if I keep talking to you long enough, I know eventually I know somebody that knows somebody that knows somebody that knows you. Very similar to when we were sitting at that table with the provost. And it was just crazy, right? That you knew exactly who it is that he was talking about. And you're like, oh my gosh, I've worked with him. So it was just amazing how sometimes that comes together. But I do recognize that maybe a lot of our members don't really fully know my background. And so um, I would just like to share a little bit. When I think about my work, I'm very passionate about student success and the student experience. I like to say that I was born in student affairs and raised in academic affairs. I came into this higher education space with a very strong lens in student affairs in terms of working in student activities in residence life. And then I also worked in a department first for academic advising at an R1 4-year institution, Virginia Commonwealth University. And then from there, I worked at the community college. And then I realized that when I think about my work broadly, the question a lot of professionals ask themselves is, what kind of higher education environment do I want to work in? What is geared best towards my skill set, and what kind of students do I want to serve and support? And so then I ended up working in a highly selective institution, College of William and Mary, liberal arts. And it really did help me understand a lot about the way that we think about liberal arts education, and helping students when they think about majors and careers aren't linear, and what does it mean to have this broader perspective of education. And then that's where I realized I needed to get my doctorate degree. So I got my doctorate degree at the College of William and Mary. And so that's where I received that. But then I became very passionate about pre-health and advising. And then I took a position back at Virginia Commonwealth University for Director of Pre-Health and Pre-Law Advising. And then from there, I went to UNC Wilmington and was the director of University College, because, of course, I was very passionate about that first year and second year advising experience. And then was promoted to be an associate dean. And then when you think about as an administrator, and I know a lot of people ask me that question of when do you know that you're ready to be, from an advisor to be a director of advisor and moving up in management or being senior level administrator. For me, I think it was really this lens of when you say, I know that I love working with students. And the higher up you go, the less you work with students and the more you work with policy and procedures. And you do see more of the challenges and issues that either policy, because policy is a blunt instrument, right? It doesn't fix everything. And so then you're still looking at addressing issues and concerns. And so then I had an amazing opportunity to work at the Elizabeth City State University. It's a small HBCU in Elizabeth City, North Carolina. And so then from there is when I came into this position as executive director. And so I share all that because I think people don't understand that it was definitely a journey in terms of understanding how do you want to work, what makes sense for you as a professional, what environment do you find that your skill set's going to make most sense for. And I had the ability to be connected with amazing mentors. I had amazing provosts. I had amazing deans. I had amazing colleagues that supported me along each step of my journey in terms of understanding how policy and procedures inform the way that we serve and support our students. And it takes time in that oven to cook, if you know what I mean, to understand like before you need to move to the next step. Because sometimes people want to move so quickly, right? I want to be in charge. And I'm like, well, why do you want to be in charge? Is it because you want to influence or is it because you want to control? Because there's a difference. You want to control what? Is what I always tell people. What do you want to really control? And then what do you want to influence? Because you know that there's a better way to build a mousetrap, if you will. Because ultimately, my goal has always been, what is the best way for us to serve students? And it's not because I always had the best ideas, but how do you bring people together in order to serve our students to the best of our ability and talents? I love students. I've always loved students in any capacity that I've worked. And so when I think about what we do in academic advising, when I think about the work that happens at institutions, this pandemic has really helped spotlight how critical our work is on campuses. Our students have been hurting in so many different ways, and our ability to raise their voices to campus level administrators, to senior level administrators, is just amazing to me how we've been able to come together as a profession to say that we are pivotal and critical in that ability to take their voices and to lift them up. But then more importantly, we have the tools, we have the skill set, and we have the knowledge in the background to be able to say this is the best way for us to create systems and to develop processes in order to help support our students for them to be able to achieve their academic goals.
Yeah, I think there's a talk story or webinar right there with all of that. And especially, like, should I move up? Should I not? When do I know? Am I trying to influence? Am I trying to control? Why do I want to be at a upper division, upper level admin? And all I have to say really is like never say never. I mean, a lot of the things that whether I've done in advising or in NACADA or my institution, I probably said, I'm never going to do that. And then I ended up doing it. And I'm like, well, never say never. You never know what's going to happen. But in our last interview, we asked about any goals you might have when you were starting or going to be starting as executive director of NACADA. And of course, it was very fluid answer because you hadn't started yet. But now that you're in the role, maybe we can ask that question again. What what would you say your goals are as executive director and maybe overall NACADA's goals moving forward to help academic advising?
Yes. So the question that you're asking, let's see, I think I'm over 120 days, I think, so far in this role. Oh, I know you're laughing right now. But I think the question is a really good one because it helps me focus. My desire to be in this position, like I was saying earlier, was not about controlling, right? It was about influencing and bringing people together because I care about our field, I care about our profession, I care about the scholarship that we develop. And so actually our board just released new strategic goals that are going to guide our association forward for the next 5 years. So I'm really excited that we were able to release that at our annual conference. And a lot of those goals point to looking at a structural review of our association. The last time that our association was really evaluated and created a new structure was over 20 years ago. And we did not have, over 13,000 members. We were not global. We were, so when you think about how we're currently structured and how we currently operate, we were not as large as we are today. And so we do need to take a look at that. So that's definitely one of our goals. Are we operating in the best structure as possible in order to do all the work that we know we need to do from a global perspective? Another one of our goals is looking at a global perspective. What does it mean to be global in this association? And are we doing what we need to do in order to make sure that we're including global perspectives, global knowledge? How are we informing and educating all of our members? And then how are we being inclusive of our global members in the work that we're doing in NACADA? And then another piece around the scholarship, and then engaging in external partnerships in terms of the work that we're doing. A lot of people are in the field of advising. When we talk about what does it mean, what does academic advising mean, how are you defining academic advising, you can see on certain campuses that advising is moving from either an academic affairs space to an enrollment management space to maybe a student affairs space. And so how are we engaging with those partners who are in those spaces, and then connecting with them in terms of what does it mean to assess academic advising goals? What does it mean to create academic advising systems? If you were like me growing up in student affairs, you're going to look to student affairs assessment tools. You're going to look to you see what I'm saying? If you're in enrollment management, you're going to be doing the same thing. And so how are we connecting with our external partners and building those relationships? So when people are talking about academic advising, we're all on the same page in terms of understanding what academic advising is and what is the best way to support our students. And so those are probably three of the main areas that I would say most immediately that we're thinking about in terms of understanding how we're going to be moving forward in the next couple of years. So, I mean, yes, it sounds like a lot of work, but I think it's very critical and necessary in terms of how we think about where NACADA is going and how we're growing and how we're moving. And then we're all doing this still within a pandemic space. And so I'm just really proud of the work that our EO staff is doing. I'm really proud of the work that the board and council and all three divisions, the region, advising communities, and our administrative division is doing in terms of continuing to move the work forward, because I know that our members are tired. They're tired of, with the work that's happening on their campuses in terms of supporting students, and then supporting just, what's going on in their own homes. And then they still turn around and do great and brilliant work for NACADA. And so from the bottom of my heart, I just always want to thank everybody who continues to support the work and the vision and the mission of our association, because many of our members, well, not many, all really are doing this because they're volunteering to support the work that we're doing. And I'm just always in awe of how much they love this association. And I'm just very grateful and thankful. And so just wanting to continue to keep our hearts raised in this work because it's critical for our students.
Yeah, and I think, with members continuously renewing their membership, it's because they believe in academic advising. They believe in their students. They believe in NACADA. They believe in what NACADA can do with moving advising forward and helping them to bring things back to their institutions. But it's just like you're saying, too, it's a global community. And I know some people still want to call it the National Academic Advising Association. It's like, no, we are NACADA, the global community for academic advising. And it's not the national conference, it's the annual conference, because we are global. We have partners everywhere. And one of the things, and you were talking about kind of like how busy and how kind of tired the advising professionals are. And one of the things we keep hearing is student retention, but then also a lot about advisor retention, and that there's probably many, if not already, many who've left advising and higher ed altogether, whether that's due to being burnt out, dealing with policy changes at their institutions, realizing during the pandemic that they have other things they want to do in life. Have you heard that? And what do you think NACADA's role can be in that?
I have heard that, unfortunately. When we think about, this fatigue when you think about all the changes that have been happening on campus, when you think about compassion fatigue, it would be probably one of the things that I speak on the most lately when I was being invited to campuses and doing keynotes on Zoom, just talking about compassion fatigue, not pouring from an empty cup, really just trying to lift people's spirits and talking about morale. I was seeing a lot of that. It wasn't as if people didn't recognize that their institutions were saying, yes, thank you, I appreciate you, but it was the pace. Working from home, I think that there was a lot of, I don't want to say misunderstanding. I think it was just this concept, right? That, oh, well, you're working from home, so you don't have to commute, you don't have to do this. But the dynamics of working from home and supporting your students, I know for me, myself, I didn't really think about the idea of having a Google cover for my phone. I was just trying to make sure that my students stayed connected with me. So I just gave them my cell phone. And then the next thing you know, you're talking to your students on your cell phone, that kind of thing. And before we were able to get software to call from our houses. And so you just, as an advisor, you just want to make sure that your students are okay. And so sometimes you can overcompensate and you can overdo it, right? And so where are your breaks? If you're working from home, you work and then you live and you live and you work. It's kind of like if you went to college and you worked in the residence hall, you lived in the residence hall and then you did your homework in your bed and you slept in your bed. It's like there's no break, like you're always in your bed. And so it was one of those moments where I think many of us just didn't really understand, how do you manage work-life balance when you're always in the same space, and how do you walk away from it? How do you stop thinking about it? Even with the pandemic, people were still living in tragedy. People were still losing their loved ones, and maybe it wasn't because of COVID, but maybe, I still lost my grandmother, or I still lost my mother, or I still lost my child, or I still lost my job. And, and you're dealing with the stresses of money and finances. And then you want to talk about registration, you know what I mean? Like, you just have to pause sometimes, and then you're taking all that in. And so I will agree with you that I did hear a lot from advisors about, like, how do I continue to do this work? I'm just emotionally spent and I'm exhausted. I think that the way that we support that in the association, and beyond the idea of, do we have presentations and workshops through the conference experiences and, webinars that talk about compassion fatigue, and how do we do that? When I think about advisors, for example, that may be furloughed or laid off, or, what are the ways that we can connect with those who may be looking to retool their resumes, looking for people to help them think about, maybe if I took a break, what does this look like for me? Maybe I need to be rejuvenated in some way. I think that there is an opportunity for us to engage with advisors or senior level administrators or directors of advising shops that are really looking for ways to help combat compassion fatigue. I know that that's really been kind of the key topics that I've been talking about lately when I've been invited to. So I think that there is a role that we can play. When I think about that from a systems level perspective, how do we engage and have that conversation? When we did our community forum, that was some parts of the conversation. So I know that our goal in the next weeks or so is to put out a communication to the association talking about the themes and topics, and then inviting further conversations of where we're developing. Is that a workshop? Is that something that we do online? What would be the best way for us to continue to support our advisors who are still struggling? When we think about why people are wanting to leave the field, are there ways that we can help to engage with senior level administrators that may or may not understand all the things that our advisors are going through right now, in terms of how do we help lighten the load, and what does that look like? And so I think that there are some things that we need to engage with, Matt. I would agree that there is something that we can do, because we're doing it on such micro scales. What would the macro level look like? Because there's a lot going on, and I don't want us to lose really great professionals just because they're just tired and they may need a break. And when I mean a break, I guess in my mind, I'm not saying I just might need a day off, right? I need a mental health break. I'm talking about, is there a better way for us to do this work? Is there a way for us to have different levels of understanding from our institutions? Is there a way for us to be at the tables and to understand what's happening what I always work really hard with my advisors or my staff is for them to understand the vision that was coming down. So there wasn't this question of what is going on. I feel like every time we turn around, we're getting a new uh, we're being told something different. Last week it was this week it's that, next week it's this, next week it's that, right? And so there's a level of transparency that really needs to take place so people understand when you're shifting directions, that you're not just shifting directions because it's fun, but you're understanding that maybe something has changed and now we have to respond, because then people can anticipate that maybe change has to happen. But what happens, or the beauty of that conversation, is that maybe you wouldn't have picked this direction if I was at the table, because I would have been able to give you that information in the first place, right? So I think there is something more that we can do to answer your question. But my heart goes out to a lot of what's happening on the campuses right now.
Yeah, and it's one of those things too. I think, I've seen a lot on TikTok when I'm scrolling through some of those videos. Not necessarily from higher ed, but a lot of, let's say, high school teachers and maybe some in higher ed, where there's even memes out there where it's like, we're burnout, we need to have a conversation, but having a pizza party and telling us good job, that doesn't cut it. And yeah.
Agreed. There was an article that came out that said there's a morale issue in higher education, and giving a free t-shirt is not going to solve it. So you're absolutely right. Those days are behind us.
Yeah. And I guess, going along with that, we're talking about advisor retention, but then there's probably also the student retention. And during the pandemic, and, still in it, but during probably fall 2020, we probably saw a lot of institutions struggle with either getting students enrolled or had a large drop off in retention after that semester ended. And there was policy changes that were temporarily changed, from not giving F grades to students deciding if they want to do a credit, no credit option, to some emergency financial aid to students. And I guess we would still say, with the pandemic still going on, many of us have returned back to our institutions. You have students on campus, but you have some students that want to remain online. Maybe some students have on-campus classes, but then also have some online classes at the same time. And, there's new protocols with COVID vaccines and testing, and there's just so much going on. And, you're talking about also like thing changes, this day it's this, and the next day it's that, or the next week it's changed to this. I mean, what do you have any advice, whether it's for students or how advisors can help their students when they sometimes may not know what is going on one day to the next?
That's such a big question, but you're absolutely right. When you think about how I remember one time I had a session because, you could tell that people, what you were just describing, like, we don't know what's going on and how to help our students. And I was just talking about the idea of grace, which I know sometimes is a concept that people are like, okay, great. Yeah, let's talk about grace. And I was like, okay. And I said, raise your hand if you've ever been in a pandemic. And I was like, and if you raise your hand, you're not telling the truth, because the last one was, and everybody started laughing. But the reality is that nobody really knows how to manage this. And they think that they may know, and then they are changing quickly in order to address whatever gap which was revealed based on the decision that they made. In my last institution, I think we did a really good job of pulling as many people to the table as possible so that we were covering the gaps and the blind spots. But that still doesn't mean that we made all the decisions correctly. But when you have everybody at the table and you quickly realize the blind spot, you're able to move in a direction quickly, and then you're informing everybody at the same time. And so it doesn't feel like you're being jerked around, right? Because you're like, remember when we made this decision, but we didn't take into account X. Oh, that's right, we didn't. So this is why we need to shift and move in this direction to do Y. What I found is that when you broaden the circle of concern, you start moving away from the idea of blame in terms of sharing a community decision, and it becomes more of a trust factor in terms of, no, you're right, we were all there, we made the decision, and I trust that if we're shifting and we're moving in a different direction, then it's probably the right way for us to move, because you definitely would have consulted me, right? Because I was there at the table when we first made the decision. And so what I'm noticing in certain institutions, I always ask the question, I said, well, who's in that meeting? Who's at the table? Who's making the decisions? Who's speaking on your behalf? Is the SGA there? Is there any student presence? I start to learn very quickly, like, who's making the decisions. What I found is that some leaders, unfortunately, believe that they need to know everything, or they feel like they are not worthy to carry the title of leader. That's very disconcerting for me, because I always tell myself that if you are the smartest person in the room, you need a new room. I don't pretend to know everything, but that doesn't lessen who I am in the room. Being a leader is a decision. It's not a title and it's not a role, right? And so just because I'm responsible is what my title dictates, right? Whether I'm a president or a provost, director of advising, my job, my role, my responsibility is to advocate on behalf of those who I'm responsible for. And so that doesn't mean I know everything. And so having the right people in the room in order to inform, right? That's broadening the circle of concern, is the best way for all of us to move forward in a pandemic where nobody has ever been a part of. And so I think I have been very surprised to find that people are managing this process with very limited information in the room. Then they're making decisions. And then when they cast it out, people are like, well, what about this? What about that? What about this? And then they go back and then they're changing everything because now people have commented enough and it makes sense. They're like, oh man, we didn't think about that. But it's okay to have people in the room and you don't know everything, because you're like, that's a great point, Matt. I didn't consider that. That's actually a great, especially if you have a student voice or a feedback, the students are going to feel like they're involved with shaping the policy. When students are, for example, there's a lot of students that are like, why am I paying my tuition for this, and this? I'm losing these experience, blah, 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 blah. But if you talked about COVID policies and protocols and we can't get you sick and there's no way for us to fix this and that and that and that, then students would have recognized like, well, we can't use these services right now for this semester until they fix this, until they fix that, until they fix this. It's all about transparency on some level. I understand that we can't always explain everything. And so I feel like that is kind of the challenge that a lot of campuses or institutions are facing. And I don't pretend to know all of what people feel comfortable in sharing. But I've always found that my mentors have always really explained to me that, Melinda, you really need to have people around you who are able to provide a certain level of expertise to guide you in your decision making. You are not going to know everything, and you should not know everything. And so that's how I've always really operated in leadership, and especially in these particular situations where advisors who are having that direct connection to students, who are feeling everything that students are feeling right now in these moments as to why I won't re-register. Maybe the student's planning to come back in the spring, but like you said, if I needed financial support, if I'm going to be online, do I have a laptop in order to take classes online? I'm taking these classes on my phone. I can take classes, but I can't pay for books. When you think about how that information or that feedback loop can give that information back to either financial aid or the registrar or to the provost or to enrollment managers in order to determine where those sources of funding could come down and be able to support student enrollment and retention, or looking at populations like our males. We know that our men are struggling in terms of being re-enrolled or transferring or coming back into school, or you're looking at particular majors. I mean, all that information and that data, Matt, is sitting out there, but who's looking at it and then being strategic about how it's being deployed? Those are some of the things that sometimes when I look at data, I'm like, who's responsible for steering and navigating and being strategic in thought and mind in terms of how we're shifting the way that we're deploying resources and how we're moving forward? But it has to start with listening.
Yeah, definitely listening and active listening and actively engaging afterwards with that. And as we're running out of time, I have tons of questions for you, but I think we'll end with this one. And that's one of your favorite quotes is "Not all who wander are lost." And I know my dear friend Evelyn Knox, this is also her favorite quote. And in one of her previous roles, she coordinated our undecided exploratory student population. And so she found that this quote was fitting for students trying to like find their way through university, but especially with finding a major, and that it's okay to explore and not know what you want to do right now. So for you, why is this one of your favorite quotes?
Well, I am an avid fan of Lord of the Rings. And so uh, Tolkien's quote hits me in so many different ways. And I do know that when we talk about exploratory or undecided students, that is something that actually can be used to kind of frame their experience. But I think for me, what hits me at the heart is that sometimes we don't enjoy the journey. We're just so caught up in the destination and the goal. And I'm very goal oriented in that way, and sometimes I struggle with perfectionism, like things have to be perfect and I have to get this goal and I have to achieve this mark. And so sometimes my life can feel very driven to like, it doesn't matter how I'm just going to, hit that goal. And as I've gotten older, I just really want to slow down and enjoy the journey a lot more. As my parents have gotten older, and my dad has Alzheimer's, and I just love sitting with him sometimes and just listen to him tell me just stories of when he was younger, and I just really enjoy slowing down and just enjoying the smaller things in life now, because I'm starting to recognize that you know we don't we're not guaranteed forever, Matt. And it is this in the small things where joy lives. And so it's not always about our achievements, and it's not always about why we're achieving, right? But it's about what we're learning as we are changing, as we earn or move towards those achievements is what's really important, right? It's always the learning process. And so when I think about the wandering part of that statement, I know you're not lost because you're always learning.
Yeah, perfectly said. And my boss has told me a few years ago that he's like, Matt, you always want to get to the goal and then you move on to the next goal. He's like, you never enjoy once you get to that finish line and just enjoy the moment or the journey that it took to get there. He's like, as much as like you keep wanting to get these goals and goals and goals, he's like, that's great, but it's like you got to enjoy it because you'll look back and be like, where did the time go? And that actually resonated with me, and I'm like, yeah, I really need to change that. And it's like changing or creating a new habit or changing an old habit. It is hard to do, but it is something I work on every day. But Melinda, if anyone has any questions, they probably everything they listen to, they're like, I definitely want Melinda either talk to our school or I have more questions to follow up, or they want to reach out to NACADA or to you. What's the best way for them to reach out?
Definitely the best way is just to email Mr. Anderso, so no N, so MRANDERSO at ksu.edu is the best way. I'm also on LinkedIn, so find me on LinkedIn is probably the best way. I'm really better with email, and LinkedIn social media platform is probably the best way to find me. And Matt, as always, I just want to thank you so much for your time, talent, and energy, and sharing this platform with us. I just always enjoy speaking with you.
Oh, same. Always love speaking with you. And I have a feeling that you're going to be on this podcast very soon again. So we will see. But Melinda, thank you so much. A lot of great info. Love these interviews. So thank you so much for joining us for this podcast today.
No, thank you, Matt.